In the video, I'll go through the unfortunate reality of the violence necessary in the American system. There's this recrudescence, and this is felt in how Americans are at each other's throats in many, many ways. And this is not a unique thing, it is not a new novel thing, it is just an occurrence that is perpetual in its manifestations. The forms, however, take different apparitions or figments or representations, countenances. So when we understand this and the lack of pusillanimity in an American versus, say, a British person who's a bit more cowed, a bit more churlish, then you get the hot-headedness of what is, and then I think Evola called the negrified version of Americans, which is that more bombastic and outspoken and quick to anger, say, truculent or irascible. But the way that we think about it then is this idea that Americans are going through a resurgence of the violence, or at least in this case, I think the idea that they're in a boiling pot, and this goes, I think, one step removed from the melting pot, is once you continue to cook a melting pot, it will irrevocably boil over, because the way that you start to taper off immigration is non-existent. Thus, you start to have an overflowing effect, and this can be recognized, you could say, with the catalyzation of the heat, or some other cooking analogy, which we won't get into today, not my cooking show at least. So this is that idea of the Gordian knot. This is something that's Mussolini raised in one of his addresses and was able to speak to, and I can reread you a segment of it here, where he goes on, this is Mussolini, to say, from 1870 to 1915 is the period in which the priests themselves of the new religion began to see the decline of their creed, beaten all along the line by decadentism in literature and by activism in practice. Activism being, in other words, nationalism, futurism, fascism. The liberal century, after having put together a large collection of Gordian knots, attempted to untie them with the World War. Never did any religion call upon its followers for such an immense sacrifice. The gods of liberalism were, perhaps, thirsty for blood. Now liberalism is about to close the doors of its deserted temples, because all peoples feel that its agnosticism is in economic matters, its indifference in political and moral matters, will lead, as they have led, to the certain ruin of states. This explains why all political experiments in the contemporary world are anti-liberal, and it is supremely ridiculous to try to classify them for the reason as being against the general trend of history. Mussolini, I think, being one of the most scathing, malefactors when it came to liberal democracy and its application, and I think rightly so. He probably foresaw the weak state, that Schmidt calls it, from the lack of focus, and there needs to be this ambit when you have a state, because otherwise it becomes a morass. It becomes this nebulous miasma which pervades everything but offers nothing, and so it starts to suffocate you when you inhale this day after day after day. In my very brief video here, I'll try to untie this examination of what the Gordian knot means for America, but I think in general you can represent the trend of this throughout modern discourse, rhetoric, the news, current affairs. All of it is symptomatic of this, and our favorite amanuensis of the decline, Spengler, has a few things to say on this from Hour of Decision, which once again is probably his most timeless work, if not powerful. It's not that Decline of the West isn't his most eminent work or preeminent work, but it's that it is the case for an applied philosophical examination into politics than it is a general metaphysics, philosophical, ontological examination. So this is why Hour of Decision is, for me, one of the most sophisticated pieces of maybe polemics. So in that, I think we will go just through a few quotes here, and the first one being, "So when they begin to lust for power and cannot attain it through themselves or their own good qualities, they ruin their estates, tempting and corrupting the people in every way possible. And hence, when by their foolish thirst for reputation, they have created among the masses an appetite for gifts and the habit of receiving them, democracy in its turn is abolished and changes into a rule of force and violence. For the people, having grown accustomed to feed at the expense of others and to depend for their livelihood on the property of others, as soon as they find a leader who is enterprising but is excluded from the honours of office by his penury, institute the rule of violence, and now, uniting their forces, massacre, banish, and plunder until they degenerate again into perfect savages and find once more a master and monarch. Rightly pointing out that every empire declines in the exact same fashion allows him basically to see or have prescience and foresee the actual qualities of stages of empire. And America in particular, as I said, are more prone to violence in the base case, which makes this even more a guarantee, an obvious step in the next direction of how the downfall will happen. There is a baying for a certain amount of blood of your enemies, and enemies become more polarized by the day. So some of these charts I'm showing you are fairly banal or just benign, but they indicate, I think, what is the undercurrent of the feeling towards antipathy of your enemy, of your, call them the, I'll say arch nemesis here because it's not so dramatic, but the nemesis of your political leanings and your alliance. Now, in America, they have this farce called democracy, obviously, where it's very well understood the last 200 years you could just buy results of the election, and that's what has been done by certain parties and like micro parties within parties. So inside the Democratic and Republican parties are moneyed class unions, basically, who are able to divvy out pecuniary rewards, not bribes, for political favors, we'll call them. And in which case we get the nominee, the presumptive nominees, and then you have the runoff, and then you have the president. The president basically enacts what was policies drawn up by his sponsors. And so in this, we start to understand how one becomes a Republican or a Democrat of power is by taking bribes, by taking super PAC donations, and then going to bat for whatever vested interests have started to barrack for you. But what happens now is that there's a huge polarity between the parties. Historically, you have quite similar interests, and the idea that politics was seen on a very higher level of international diplomacy, whereas domestic policy was represented mostly around state interests with slight deviations when it came to regional interests. So if you're from the South or the Midwest or the East or West Coast, then you have slightly different interests. But with the advent of popular media, and you have what is the indoctrination of vast swathes of people under the same schools of thought, you lose that parochial attitude, and you get a much grander, unified vision of this is the good way, that is the bad way. And this is a natural effect. And so Republicans and Democrats stopped being, you say, on the same team somewhere in the mid-2000s after George Bush, I would say, was able to highlight how closely aligned they all were when they went to a war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's very easily seen that the resultant pushback from Americans to choose Obama, who was a very polarizing figure himself because of his background and the things that he said and did in office, allowed for the rise of Trump. Trump has now presented what is this pre-Caesar or Caesar effect, and in doing so highlights what is now the blood over money politics. We want to pick someone who we feel has our best interests regardless of how they go to market with those propositions. We don't necessarily care that Jeb Bush has the backing of X and Y and Z. We go, no, but he's a decrepit doofus with a smarmy, dislikable family backing him. We would prefer the rogue, cavalier American hero. And that's the summary of the 2016 election, the rebuking of the old haggard wench and the savior of mankind. So whether he was or not for those people, I think that's the idea. And the idea behind the man is obviously way more important than the practice, because in an election, you've yet to actually demonstrate your applicable skill in that fashion. Regardless, we are today in the early stages, I would say, of the next 20 to 30 years. We'll have this pressurization of the political milieu, and so young men in particular will start to become vehemently opposed to oppression. And oppression here is not by or ipso facto the state going out and putting you in a concentration camp or beating you with batons. But it is much more around what you're allowed to think, seek, do, act, perform into, because you have the feminization of governmental institutions, which pervades into other things like universities and workplaces. So it feels like society is out to get you because society is just catering towards a different profile from you. That is the seen as previously or historically oppressed female and browns, fellaheen. Because the white man, he's been championed for so long, there needed to be a comeuppance. There needed to be, in the story of the white man, some challenge to his position as champion. And what that resulted in was actually the white woman, ironically enough, poisoning his chalice before dinner. Now, this is going to have to be stomached, and to see the reverberal change that's coming back upon the rest of the world is the natural cause and effect of what has happened. You can't push the pendulum and not expect it to come back and hit you in the face. It's the true, desperation of the sower when they're reaping, which for some reason is always lost on them when they're sowing what the actual effects will be. But Spengler rightly saw these things, and we now know that he was able to predict. So maybe apropos of that, I'll just read you another excerpt here. It was only then that the social revolution began to have the economic tendency which found expression in agitators' theories, and this tendency was concerned not with the organization and aims of the economic system, but with the monetary value of its investments and products. Contrasts between rich and poor were created in order to start the struggle between them. The idea was that everything available for turning into money should be shared out or held in common. If possession of it could not be obtained, it was to be destroyed so that no others should continue to possess it. From this way of feeling and thinking, not of the lower orders of society, but of their self-nominated spokesmen, everything arose that in the classical age was called the equal distribution of goods, and today is called class war and socialism. It is a struggle from the above and the below of society, and it is fought between leaders of nations and leaders from the underworld to whom the working classes are but objects and means for their own aims. Aging society puts up only a feeble defense. Its born enemies, however, continue to attack ruthlessly until the rising Caesarism of the proletarian dictatorship makes an end of the Gracchian and Catilinarian tendencies. Here for me, I think, is the essential point and summarily proffered to us by Spengler, suggesting that, and once again rightly so, that we are seeing the attack, and the attacks become relentless because of the desperation. You can see power slipping from your grasp, and what that lends to one is the anxiety that losing power means your enemy will now punish you as you feel as if he should. There is this idea that you've behaved in a way that requires comeuppance, or retribution, or a reckoning, and in that you will feel the full weight of what is the retribution of the suffered party. So if the liberal in particular, and this is that leftist-styled neoliberal Democrat, feels as if his lawfare is something of a last gasp. It's this idea here, and you can see the lawsuits, particularly against Trump and other deemed heretical parties of democracy, that we will use all the instruments available to us to apprehend you, to handicap you, to hamstring you, to jawbone you into doing what we want you to do, which is to shut up and obey us. And this is that very leftist feeling of you're not better than us, and so you should be abiding by the same rules that we do, and our rules for you are actually putting you into a second-class position because we feel as if you had put us in a second-class position historically. True or not true? It is to say that the white man, particularly in ages between 15 and 55, have historically had power, which means that they now must be punished for that historical artifact. And by doing this, you take a very personal approach, you try to specifically injure them in that way rather than blanketing the punishment out so that you can meet it in a way that feels just and fair. You are targeted in how you act. So we use the notions that men are, say, more brash, more prone to violence, and then thus punish those things in outsized ways. So we don't take necessarily, we take a niggardly approach when it comes to female punishment, and we say we're not going to mete out very harsh punishments in the realm of, say, burning of flags or protests. You might have a few slap on the wrists and your visa's been revoked or whatever nonsense, but there's no real punishment there. Whereas if you see a surge of real violence or the imminent notion of violence, let's say in the January 6th storming of the Capitol, then the punishments that are meted out are much more severe because there's an actual threat here where white men aged between 15 and 55 has started to realize that we've been punishing them, and we are a bit scared that that swinging pendulum is going to smash us to flinders. Now, I think for us, it's very important to understand that if you want, well, we are the white men in that age group, so the power has always resided with us. We have it bound to who we are because the energy you have inside of you is, first it's the bottomless and largesse of energy in general. Women don't typically have it. Women have a lot of good traits and features. It's not to say you can't be a strong, powerful woman. It's much more the masculinity of, or the chauvinism of something where the American man represents this thing that he's capable of doing, and that's violence and the exertion of power. And so when we have that understanding, it's very easy to see why people would feel threatened. When you forget it, then you become a very meek and callow individual. And that's not useful for anybody because the left don't like you when you're weak because you represent a victim, and they feel as if you can't be a victim, so they want to continue to just kick you down. They're more than willing to punch down in that regard. But if you are trying to show your power, then they're trying to clip your wings because they don't want to see you soar above them. Now, I'm mixing my analogies here, but you get the picture. Now, the very easy way of understanding this is when you look at the cross-sectional data of who is in favor of what in America. And that goes into your sex now. Sex and gender are playing much more important roles in America because we've moved beyond the age of station, vocation, class, things like this. So you reduce down to another level who you are. And who you are is represented by your sex and by your ethnicity. And so in doing a data analysis here, we can quite quantitatively see that if you are a white man of certain means and regards, and start to think about religiosity here much more aligned with ethnicity, because it's a little bit meaningless to take evangelical Protestants as anything other than white men, and then Catholics as anything other than fellaheen, brown, third worlders. So the religiosity aspect will lose its place over the next 100 years, say 150 years in America. But nevertheless, if you're white and middle to low educated, it's very clear you pick Trump. And if you're hyper-religious, and this is cult aspect-ish, which is going into the Mormonism here or anything evangelical, Scientology or anything that's more nouveau in terms of religious experience is going to lean heavily towards Trump if you're white, and the other if you're not. The historical artifact of political parties just means that each party is now waiting to have its Caesar come to position of presumptive power, which for them is a good thing. I think it's worth holding the establishment placeholder ready for someone to walk in and take that. It's not that every single Caesar now will be Republican after Trump just because he was, and there are always factions fighting it out in any empire, and it doesn't take a genius to understand that the Romans had the same exact issue with the different houses, but we call them Democrats and Republicans, and that's fine. So there'll be a democratic Caesar at some point when they realize that the power resides in a certain type of person. The biggest issue, once again, and maybe pulling this back to being a Gordian knot, is that violence is imminent when the parties you have remain factional. And so having a team of brown people of like 15 different colors, Asians, and then Jews, Hispanics, were usually brown anyway, and then a bunch of harpies, Haradan women, just shrewing it out with each other. Then you have a party that's ripe for its own Gordian knot. It's like an internal Gordian knot. It's a Gordian knot within a Gordian knot, because the only way to solve these issues is with violence. You can't vote in and out these different things and still have a coherence. They're irreconcilable. Ideas don't work like that. They're not tradable, fungible, and transactional goods. You can't say, I'll take this idea and you take this idea as some sort of compromise, because people don't compromise on what they want or feel or believe in that way. You can manipulate them and you can brainwash them and indoctrinate them, for sure, that's fine. But when you're working with such distinct and dissimilar parties, particularly with the range of, you could say, dispositions and IQ factor here, I am not going to be able to convince you that some very, very low IQ fellaheen third worlder is going to be able to believe the same thing as me, a very high qualified Jewish liberal. Now, you might be on the same team as me for some things, but when there comes a point in time that this has to be resolved, guess the way it's going to get resolved? It's through violence, because there is no other way that the human's going to react when pushed to an extremist in that way, and such that we are deciding the sovereign is always in the exception will become out in this extreme position, extreme scenarios. So for further to this, I think we'll just clarify with a little bit more Spengler. He goes on to say, the further we advance into this Caesarism of the Faustian world, the more clearly will it emerge who is destined ethically to be the subject and who the object of historical events. The dreary train of world improvers has now come to an end of its amble through these centuries, leaving behind it, as sole monument of its existence, mountains of printed paper. The Caesars will now take its place. High policy, the art of the possible, will again enter upon its eternal heritage, free from all systems and theories, itself the judge of the facts by which it rules, and the gripping the world between its knees like a good horseman. And I might recycle many of these Spenglerian quotes, excerpts, because it's just so timeless and poignant and relevant and transcendental in how it displays the truth of the current situation and the preceding situation. We are in a time where we're just waiting out the periods between true leadership. Having someone come and lecture you and hector you on certain subjects and topics is not going to be able to take the place of a man who does what he wants, and the rest will just follow. They'll bear and grin it if they're on the opposite team, or cheer along with it if they are on that team. It's very hard to not like a winner. Americans love winners in that regard, but they also love violence. So we'll see that valence come about, where we have the idea that an American Caesar will have a certain assumption or presumption of violence around their own attaining power, because the idea is that Americans like it. They want the violence aspect to their leadership, to their political class. There's a huge history of violence in America, and from wars through to political duels and having presidents themselves who were participating in wars, but also violence, you say, in some regards. Teddy Roosevelt boxing, for instance, in the White House. So it is the nature of an American to be violent in, I would say, productive ways. Violence is not a bad thing. There's a lot of treatises and books on the subject if you're interested, but I think in general we can always view violence as the necessary human mechanism around resolved disputes and anything that you would see as coercion or coaxing into an agreed position. We need violence because it resolves the dispute of human nature. And in understanding an American version of violence, you can see that the party with the most potential for violence will be the one that wins, because in the end, if you don't like something, you can rebuke it. You can forcefully overturn it with violence. They'll say, no, this is the law, this is the rules. But if they haven't got the means to enforce any of those things, then really they're just banking on you being respectful. And that can be pushed to a limit where it will no longer be possible to obey in a very nice way. So the Gordian knot will become severed. It'll get its snipping, whereby you'll see, as I said before, over the next few decades, this pressurization of the American boiling pot. And from this, I anticipatory, as you could probably hear, of something grand, something great. Not peaceful, not nice, but something where we can at least have the idea that history is being made and we can recognize the events as something that will be talked about and a man that's name will echo throughout eternity.